Hi everyone. Let me do up my hair. Just this is how a man does his hair. He looks at the mirror. He can barely see himself in the mirror. This mirror's so gross, it's nasty. It's like I gotta take the mirror out of the box, I think. Okay, yeah. Somebody's been using this mirror. He looks nasty in it. He goes, gross. Gross, what woman could ever want me? He does his hair. And I was thinking I'd get back to some classic Brandon Block tactics instead of talking out my ass about video games. Which seemed like a great idea last night when I was kind of stoned. But you know what? It's déclassé. So instead, today, I'm going to read Imlac's narrative from Rasselas, Prince of Abbysnia. Chapter 8, The History of Imlac. The close of the day is, in the regions of the torrid zone, the only season of diversion and entertainment, and it was therefore midnight before the music ceased and the princesses retired. Rasselas then called for his companion and required him to begin the story of his life. "Sir," said Imlac, "my history will not be long. The life that is devoted to knowledge passes silently away and is very little diversified by events. To talk in public, to think in solitude, to read and to hear, to inquire and answer inquiries is the business of a scholar. He wanders about the world without a pomp or terror, and is neither known nor valued by men like himself. But by men like himself. I was born in the kingdom of Guayama, at no great distance from the fountain of the Nile. My father was a wealthy merchant who traded between the inland countries of Africa and the ports of the Red Sea. He was honest, frugal, diligent, but of mean sentiments and narrow comprehension. He desired only to be rich, and to conceal his riches, lest he should be spoiled by the governors of the province." "Surely," said the prince, "my father must be negligent of his charge if any man in his dominions dares take that which belonged to another. Does he not know that and perhaps here with less impatience of the governor. Oppression is, in the Abyssinian dominions, neither frequent nor tolerated, but no form of government has yet been discovered by which cruelty can be wholly prevented. Subordination supposes power on the part and subjugation on the other. If power be in the hands of men, it will sometimes be abused. The vigilance of the supreme magistrate may do much, but much will still remain undone. He can never know all the crimes that are committed, and can seldom punish the ones he knows." "This," said the prince, "I do not understand, but I'd rather hear thee than dispute. Continue with thy narration." "My father," proceeded Imlac, "originally intended that I should have no other education than as might qualify me for commerce, and discovering in me my great strength of memory and quickness of apprehension, often declared his hope that I should be sometime the richest man in Abyssnia." "Why," said the prince, "did thy father desire the increase of his wealth when it was already greater than he durst discover or enjoy? I am unwilling to doubt thy veracity. Inconsistencies cannot both be true." "Inconsistencies," answered Imlac, "cannot both be right, but imputed to man, they may both be true. Yet diversity is not inconsistency. My father might expect a time of greater security. However, some desire is necessary to keep life in motion, and he whose real wants are supplied must admit those of fancy." "This," said the prince, "I can in some measure conceive. I repent that I interrupted thee. With this hope," proceeded Imlac, "he sent me to school. But when I had once found the delight of knowledge, I felt the pleasure of intelligence and the pride of invention. I began silently to despise riches and determined to disappointment the purpose of my father, whose grossness of conception raised my pity. I was 20 years old before his tenderness would expose me to the fatigue of travel, in which time I had been instructed by successive masters in all the literature of my native country. As every hour taught me something new, I lived in a continual course of gratification. But as I advanced towards manhood, I lost much of the reverence with which I had been used to look on my instructors, because when the lessons were ended, I did not find them wiser or better than common men. At length my father resolved to initiate me in commerce, and opening one of his subterranean treasuries, counted out 10,000 pieces of gold. "This, young man," said he, "is a stock with which you must negotiate. I begin with less than a fifth part, and you see how well diligence and parsimony have increased it. This is your own to waste or improve, if you squander it by negligence or caprice. You must wait for my death before you will be rich. If in 4 years you double your stock, we will thenceforth let subordination cease, and live together as friends and partners, for he shall always equal with me who is equally skilled in the art of growing rich." We laid our money upon camels, concealed in the bales of cheap goods, and traveled to the shore of the Red Sea. When I cast my eyes on the expanse of waters, my heart bounded like that of a prisoner escaped. I felt an unextinguishable curiosity kindled in my mind, and resolved to snatch this opportunity of seeing the manners of other nations, and of learning sciences unknown in Abbysnia. I remember that my father had obliged me to the improvement of my stock, not by a promise which I ought not to violate, but by a penalty which I was at liberty to incur, and therefore determined to gratify my predominant desire, and by drinking at the fountain of knowledge, to quench the thirst of curiosity. As I was supposed to trade without connection with my father, it was easy for me to become acquainted with the master of ship and procure a passage to some other country. I had no motives of choice to regulate my voyage. It was sufficient that, for me, wherever I wandered, I should be in a country I had not seen before. I therefore entered a ship bound for Surat, having a letter from my father declaring my intention. Chapter 9, the History of Imlac, continued. When I first entered upon the war of the waters and lost sight of land, I looked around about me with pleasing terror, and thinking my soul enlarged by the boundless prospect, I imagined I could gaze around me forever without satiety, but in a short time I grew weary of looking on barren uniformity, where I could only see what I had already seen. I then descended into the ship, and doubted for a while whether all my future pleasures would not end like this in disgust and disappointment. Yet, surely, said I, the ocean and the land are very different. The only variety of water is rest and motion, but the earth has mountains and valleys, deserts and cities. It is inhabitable by men of different customs and contrary opinions, and I may hope to find variety in life, though I should miss it in nature. With this thought, I quieted my mind, and amused myself during the voyage, sometimes by learning from the sailors the art of navigation, which I had never practiced, and sometimes forming schemes for my conduct in different situations, in not one of which I have ever been placed. I was almost weary of my naval amusements when we landed safely at Surat. I secured my money, and purchasing some commodities for show, joined myself to a caravan that was passing in the inland country. My companions, for some reason or other, conjectured that I was rich, and by my inquiries and admiration, finding that I was ignorant, considered me as a novice whom they had the right to cheat, and who was to learn at the usual expense the art of fraud. They exposed me to theft of servants and the exaction of officers, and saw me plundered upon false pretenses, without any advantage to themselves but that of rejoicing in the superiority of their own knowledge. "Stop a moment," said the prince. Oh, that's my phone. "Stop a moment," said the prince. Prince phone. is in there. Is there such depravity in man as that he should injure another without benefit to himself? I could easily conceive that all are pleased with superiority, but your ignorance was merely accidental, which, being neither your crime nor your folly, could afford them no reason to applaud themselves. And the knowledge which they had, and which you wanted, they might have effectually shown you by warning as betraying you. Pride, said Imlac, is seldom delicate. It will please itself with very mean advantages, and envy feels not its own happiness, but when it may be compared with the misery of others. They were my enemies because they grieved to think me rich, and my oppressors because they delighted to find me weak. Proceed, said the prince. I don't know the facts from which you relate, but imagine that you impute them to me by mistaken motives. In this company, said Imlac, I ride to Agra, the capital of Indostan, the city in which the great Mogul commonly resides. I applied myself to the language of the country, and in a few months was able to converse with the learned men, some of whom I found morose and reserved, and others easy and communicative. Some were unwilling to teach another what they had with difficulty learned themselves, and some showed that the end of their studies was to gain the dignity of instructing. To the tutor of the young princes I recommended myself so much that I was presented to the emperor as a man of uncommon knowledge. The emperor asked me many questions concerning my country and my travels, and though I cannot now recollect anything that he uttered above the power of a common man, he dismissed me, astonished at his wisdom and enamored of his goodness. My credit was now so high that the merchants with whom I traveled applied to me for recommendations to the ladies of the court. I was surprised at their confidence and solicited, gently reproaching them with the practices on the road. They heard me with cold indifference and showed no tokens of shame or sorrow. They then urged their request with the offer of a bribe, but what I would not do for kindness, I would not do for money, and refused them, not because they had injured me, but because I would not enable them to injure others, for I knew they would make use of my credit to cheat those who should buy their wares. Having resided at Agra till there was no more to be learned, I traveled into Persia, where I saw many remains of ancient magnificence, and observed many new accommodations of life. The Persians are a nation eminently social, and their assemblies afford me daily opportunities of remarking characters and manners, and tracing human nature through all its variations. From Persia, I passed into Arabia, and there I saw a nation at once pastoral and warlike, who live without any settled habitation, whose only wealth is their flocks and herds, yet carried on through all ages of hereditary war with all mankind, though they neither covet nor envy their possessions. Chapter 10, Imlac's History Continued, a dissertation upon poetry. Wherever I went, I found that poetry was considered as the highest learning, and regarded with veneration somewhat approaching to that which men will pay to the angelic nature, and it fills me with wonder that in almost all countries the most ancient poets are considered the best. Whether it be that every other kind of knowledge is an acquisition gradually attained, and poetry is a gift conferred at once, or that the first poetry of every nation surprised them as a novelty, and retained the credit by consent which it received by accident first, or whether as the province of poetry is to describe nature and passion, which are always the same, the first writers took possession of the most striking objects for description, and most probable occurrence for fiction, and left nothing to those that followed them but transcription of the same events and new combinations of the same images. Whatever the reason, it's commonly observed that early writers are in possession of nature, and their followers of the art would at first excel in strength and innovation, and later in elegance and refinement. I was desirous to add my name to this illustrious fraternity. I read all the poets of Persia and Arabia, and was able to repeat by memory volumes that are suspended in the mosque of Mecca, but I soon found that no man was ever great by imitations. My desire of excellence impelled me to transfer my attention to nature and to life. Nature was to be my subject, and men to be my auditors. I could never describe what I had not seen. I could not hope to move those with the delight or terror to whose interests and opinions I did not understand. Being now resolved to be a poet, I saw everything with new purpose. My sphere of attention was suddenly magnified. No knowledge was to be overlooked. I arranged mountains and deserts for images and resemblances, and pictured upon my mind every tree of the forest and flower of the valley. I observed with equal care the crags of the rock and the pinnacles of the palace. Sometimes I wandered along the mazes of the rivulet, and sometimes watched the changes of the summer clouds. To a poet, nothing can be useless. Whatever is beautiful and whatever is dreadful must be familiar to his imagination. He must be conversant with all that is awfully vast or elegantly little. The plants of the garden and the animals of the world, the minerals of the earth, the meteors of the sky, must all concur to store his mind with inexhaustible variety, for every idea is useful to the enforcement or decoration of moral or religious truth, and he who most will have most power of diversifying his scenes and of gratifying his reader with remote allusions and unexpected instruction. All the appearances of nature I was therefore careful to study, and every country which I have surveyed has contributed something to my poetical powers. In so wide a survey, said the prince, you must surely have left much unobserved. I have lived till now within the circuit of these mountains, and yet cannot walk abroad without sight of something which I had never beheld before, or never heeded. The business of a poet, says Imlac, is to examine not the individual, but the species, to remark general properties and a large appearance. He does not think of numbers of streaks of the tulip, or describe the different shades of the verdure of the forest. He is to exhibit in his portraits of nature such prominent and striking features as recall to the original to every mind, and must neglect minuter discriminations which one may have remarked and another have neglected, for those characteristics which are alike obvious to vigilance and carelessness. But the knowledge of nature is only half the task of a poet. He must be acquainted likewise with all modes of life. His character requires that he estimate the happiness and misery of every condition, observe the powers of all the passions in all their combinations, and trace the changes of the human mind, as they are modified by various institutions and accidental influences of climate or custom, from the sprightliness of infancy to the despondence of decrepitude. He must divest himself of the prejudices of his age or country. He must consider right and wrong in their abstract and invariable state. He must disregard present laws and opinions, and rise to the general and transcendental truth, which will always be the same. He must therefore content himself with the slow progress of his name, contempt the applause of his own time, and commit his claims to the justice of posterity. He must write as the interpreter of nature and the legislator of mankind, and consider himself presiding over the thoughts and manners of future generations as a being superior to the time and place. His labor is not yet at an end. He must know many languages and many sciences, and that his style might be worthy of his thoughts must be incessant practice, familiarized to every delicacy of speech and grace of harmony. Chapter 11. Imlac's narrative continued. A hint of pilgrimage. Imlac now felt the enthusiastic fit, and was proceeding to aggrandize his own profession when the prince cried out, "Enough! Thou hast convinced me that no human being can ever be a poet. Proceed with thy narration." To be a poet, said Imlac, is indeed very difficult. So difficult, returned the prince, that I will at present hear no more of his labors. Tell me whither you went, and what you had seen in Persia. From Persia, said the poet, I traveled through Syria, and for 3 years resided in Palestine, where I conversed with great numbers of the northern and western nations of Europe, the nations which are now in possession of all power and all knowledge, whose armies are irresistible and whose fleets command the remotest parts of the globe. When I compare these men with the natives of our own kingdom and those surround us, they appear almost another order of beings. In their countries, it is difficult to wish for anything that might not be obtained. 1,000 arts, of which we never heard, are continually labored for their convenience and pleasure, and whatever their own climate has designed them, it's supplied by their commerce. By what means, said the prince, are the Europeans thus powerful? Or why, since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade and conquest, cannot the Asiatics and Africans invade their coasts, plant colonies in their ports, and give laws to their natural princes. The same wind that carries them back will bring us thither. They are more powerful, sir, than we, answered Imlac, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance, as man governs the other animals. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not what the reason can be, but the unsearchable will of the Supreme Being. When, said the prince with a sigh, shall they be able to visit Palestine, and mingle with this mighty confluence of nations? Till that happy moment shall arrive, let me fill up the time with such representations as thou canst give me. I am not ignorant of the motive that assembles with such numbers in that place, and I cannot but consider it as the center of wisdom and piety, to which the best and wisest of men in every land must be continually resorting. There are some nations, said Imlac, that send few visitants to Palestine, for many numerous and learned sects in Europe concur to censure pilgrimage as superstitious, or deride it as ridiculous. You know, said the prince, how little my life has made me acquainted with the diversity of opinions. It would be too long to hear the arguments on both sides. You have considered them. Tell me the result. Pilgrimage, said Imlac, like many other acts of piety, must be reasonable or superstitious, according to the principles on which it is performed. Long journeys in search of truth are not commanded. Truth, such as is necessary to the regulation of life, is always found where it is honestly sought. Change of place is no natural cause of the increase of piety, for it inevitably produces dissipation of the mind. Yet, since men go every day to view fields where great actions have been performed, and return with stronger impressions of the event, curiosity of the same kind may naturally dispose us to view that country whence our religion had its beginning, and I believe no man surveys those awful scenes without some confirmation of holy resolutions. That the Supreme Being may not be more easily propitiated in one place than another. It's a dream of idle superstition, but that some places may operate upon our own minds in an uncommon manner is an opinion which hourly experience will justify. He who supposes that his vices may be more successfully combated in Palestine will perhaps find himself mistaken, yet he may go thither without folly. He who thinks that they will be more freely pardoned dishonors at once his reason and religion. These, said the prince, are European distinctions. I will consider them another time. What have you found to the effect of knowledge? Are those nations happier than we? There is so much infelicity, said the poet, in the world that scarce any man has leisure from his own distresses to estimate the comparative happiness of others. Knowledge is certainly one of the means of pleasure, as is confessed by the natural desires which every mind feels of increasing his ideas. Ignorance is a mere privation by which nothing can be produced. It is vacuity in which the soul sits motionless and torpid, for want of attraction, and without knowing why. We always rejoice when we learn, and grieve when we forget. I am therefore inclined to conclude that if nothing counteracts the natural consequence of learning, we grow more happy as our minds take a wider range. In enumerating the particular comforts of life, we shall find many advantages on the side of the Europeans. They cure wounds and diseases with which we languish and perish. We suffer inclement clemencies of weather which they can obviate. They have engines for the dispatch of many laborers' works which we must perform by manual industry. There is such communication between distant places that one friend can hardly be said to be absent from another. Their policy removes all public inconvenience. They have roads cut through the mountains, the bridges laid over their rivers, and if we descend to the privacies of their life, their habituations are more commodious and their possessions are more secure. They are surely happy, said the prince, who have these conveniences, of which I envy none so much as the facility with which separated friends exchange their thoughts. The Europeans, entered Imlac, are less unhappy than we, but they are not happy. Human life is everywhere in a state which much is to be endured, and little is to be enjoyed. Chapter 12. The Story of Imlac, continued. I am not yet willing, said the prince, to suppose that happiness is so parsimoniously distributed to mortals, nor can I believe that, if I had the choice of life, I should be able to fill every day with pleasure. I would injure no man, and should provoke no resentments. I would relieve every distress, and should enjoy the benefiction of gratitude. I would choose my friends among the wise, and my wife among the virtuous, and therefore should be in no danger from treachery or unkindness. My children should be my care, learned, and pious, and would repay to my age what their childhood had received. What would dare to molest him whom I call on every side thousands enriched by his bounty or assisted by his power? And why not life should be glide quietly away in the soft reciprocation of protection and reverence? All this may be done without the help of European refinements, which appear by their effects to be rather specious and useful. Let us leave them and pursue our journey. From Palestine, said Imlac, I passed through many regions of Asia. In the more civilized kingdoms as a trader, and among the barriers of the mountains as a pilgrim. At last I began to long for my native country, that I might repose after all my travels and fatigues in the place where I had spent my earliest years, and gladden my old companions with the recital of my adventures. Often did I figure to myself with those whom I had sported away the gay hours of dawning life, sitting around in its evening, wondering at my tales and listening to my counsels. When this thought had taken possession of my mind, I considered every moment as wasted which not bring me nearer to Abbysnia. I hastened to Egypt, and, notwithstanding my impatience, was detained 10 months in the contemplation of its ancient magnificence, and inquiries after the remains of its ancient learning. I found in Cairo a mixture of all nations. Some brought thither by love of knowledge, some by the hope of gain, many by desire of living after their own manner without observation, and of lying hid in the obscurity of multitudes. For in a city as populous as Cairo, it is possible to obtain at some time the gratification of society and the secrecy of solitude. From Cairo I traveled to Suez, and embarked on the Red Sea, passing along the coast until I arrived at a port from which I had departed 20 years before. Here I joined myself to a caravan and re-entered my native country. Now I expected the caresses of my kinsmen and congratulations of my friends, and was not without hope that my father, whatever value he had set upon riches, would with gladness and pride have a son who was able to add to the felicity and honor of the nation. But I was soon convinced that my thoughts were vain. My father had been dead 14 years, having divided his wealth among my brothers, who removed to some other provinces. Of my companions, the greater part was in the grave, the rest, some could with difficulty remember me, and some considered me as one corrupted by foreign manners. A man used to the vicissitudes is not easily dejected. I forgot, after a time, my disappointment, and endeavored to recommend myself to the nobles of the kingdom. They admitted me to their tables, heard my story, and dismissed me. I opened a school and was prohibited to teach. I then resolved to sit down in the quiet of a domestic life and addressed a lady that was fond of my conversation, but rejected my suit because my father was a merchant. Wearied at last with solicitations and repulses, I resolved to hide myself forever from the world and depend no longer on the opinion or caprice of others. I waited for the time when the gate of the Happy Valley should open, that I might bid farewell to hope and fear. The day came, my performance was distinguished with favor, and I resigned myself with joy to perpetual confinement. Hast thou found happiness here at last? Said Rasselas. Tell me without reserve, art thou content with thy condition, or dost thou wish to begin wondering and inquiring again? All the inhabitants of this valley celebrate their lot, and at the annual visit of the emperor invite others to partake of their felicity. Great prince, said Imlac, I shall speak the truth. I know not one of your attendants who does not lament the hour when he entered this retreat. I am less unhappy than the rest, because I have a mind replete with images, which I can bury and combine to pleasure. I can amuse my solitude by the renovation of the knowledge which begins to fade from my memory, and by the recollection of the accidents of my past, yet all this ends in sorrowful consideration that my acquirements are now useless, and that none of my pleasures can be enjoyed. The rest, whose minds have no impression but the present moment, are either corroded by malignant passions, or sit stupid among the gloom of perpetual vacancy. What passions can infest those, says the prince, who have no rivals? We are in a place where impotence precludes malice, and where all envy is repressed by the community of enjoyments. There may be community, said Imlac, of material possessions, but there can never be a community of love or of esteem. It must happen that one will please more than another, and that he knows himself despised will be envious, and still more envious and malevolent if he is condemned to live in the presence of those who despise him. The invitations by which they allure others to a state which they feel to be wretched proceed from the natural malignity of hopeless misery. They are wary of themselves and of each other, and expect to find relief in new companions. Then they envy the liberty which their folly has forfeited, and would gladly see all mankind in prison like themselves. From this crime, however, I am wholly free. No man can say he is wretched by my persuasion. I look with pity on the crowds who are annually soliciting admission to captivity, and wish that it were lawful for me to warn them of their danger. My dear Imlac, said the prince, I will open to thee my whole heart. I have long meditated an escape from the happy valley. I have examined the mountains on every side, but feel myself insuperably barred. Teach me the way to break my prison. Thou shalt be the companion of my flight, the guide of my rambles, and the partner of my fortune, and my sole director in the choice of life. Sir, answered the poet, your escape will be difficult, and perhaps you will soon repent your curiosity. The world, which you figure to yourself smooth and quiet as the lake in the valley, you will see a sea foaming with tempests and boiling with whirlpools. You will be sometimes overwhelmed by the waves of violence, sometimes dashed against the rocks of treachery. Amidst wrongs of frauds, competitions, and anxieties, you will wish 1,000 times for these seats of quiet, and willingly quit hope to be free from fear. Do not seek to deter me from my purpose, said the prince. I am impatient to see what thou hast seen, and since thou art weary of the valley thyself, it is evident that thy former state was better than this. Whatever the consequence of my experiment, I am resolved to judge with my own eyes the various conditions of men, and then to deliberately make my choice of life. I'm afraid, said Imlac, you're hindered by stronger restraints than my persuasion, yet, if your determination is fixed, I do not counsel you to despair. Few things are impossible to diligence and skill.